My name is Emily Bennett. I'm 34, a design teacher from Chicago. And the night my family erased me began long before they said the words out loud. It started with years of quiet comparisons, the small humiliations that felt harmless until they weren't. My sister Lily was everything I wasn't. Charming, confident, engaged to Brandon Carter, the heir of a construction empire that could buy a new identity with a single check. When they announced her wedding, it wasn't just a celebration. It was a transaction. $290,000. That was the number that ended whatever illusion of love I had left. They said it was an investment in the daughter who would bring the family name prestige. I was the one who didn't bring returns, the dreamer who never fit into their idea of success. I remember sitting at the table hearing my father's calm voice turn something sacred into a deal. My mother didn't flinch. She only smiled the way people do when they've already made peace with their betrayal. That night, something inside me broke cleanly without sound. They thought they had sold a house, but what they really sold was their last chance to keep a daughter. And soon they would learn what that loss would cost. Mom smiled that careful smile she used when she had bad news wrapped in sugar. The wedding will cost a lot, but it's worth it. This is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, Emily. My name left her mouth like an afterthought. I placed my fork down gently, my voice steady, though my hands trembled under the table. You're selling the house to pay for the wedding. Dad leaned back, eyes cold. We're investing in Lily's future. She's marrying into success. You, on the other hand, have chosen uncertainty. I felt my throat tighten. Uncertainty I've been teaching for 8 years. I paid the property taxes after you lost your job. Remember? He didn't flinch. We all make sacrifices for the family. You've done your part. It's time to move forward. Lily touched his arm lightly, her tone syrupy, sweet. Dad's right, Em. You'll understand someday. I wanted to laugh, but no sound came out. It wasn't the money that stung, it was the ease with which they erased me. The walls that had seen every argument, every childhood birthday, every late-night talk with my father, before he changed into this stranger, they were selling all of it as if it never mattered. Mom's voice sliced through my thoughts. You've always been the dreamer. You chase things that never pay off. Lily is practical. She knows how to build a life. My heart thudded against my ribs. You mean she knows how to marry one? For a second, no one moved. Then, Dad's voice dropped an octave. Watch your tone. I nodded slowly, my jaw tight, the words burning in my throat, but refusing to come out. The clock ticked behind me, marking the silence between us. When dinner ended, I gathered the plates, forcing a polite smile that felt like glass cracking in my cheeks. Mom stood by the sink humming as if nothing had just happened. I wanted to scream at her, ask how she could do this to me, but instead I said softly, Mom, I still love you, even if you think I'm a failure. She didn't look up, just rinsed a dish and said, You'll thank us someday. I walked into the living room, the dim light from the chandelier spilling across the polished floors. The air smelled faintly of lemon polish and something colder finality. On the coffee table sat a folder thick with papers. I picked it up thinking it was one of Dad's work files. Inside, a photocopy of a real estate contract bore my name in looping cursive. My signature. The problem was I had never signed it. The date next to the forged signature was last week on my father's birthday. My stomach dropped. I ran my fingers over the page, tracing the ink. It wasn't even a good forgery. Whoever did it didn't know how I wrote the E in Emily, the small hook I always added. My breath came faster. I went upstairs, shut my old bedroom door, and pulled out my phone. My hands shook as I scrolled to Mark's number. He'd been a friend from college who now worked as a financial attorney downtown. He answered on the second ring. Emily. It's been years. I think my parents forged my signature to sell our house. I said, my voice breaking. Silence. Then he said carefully, Do you have the document? Yes. Text me a photo, right now. I did. There was a pause, the kind that stretched and filled every inch of my chest with dread. When he spoke again, his tone was clipped. Emily, this is bad. That signature's fake, and if they used it to authorize a sale, it's criminal fraud. It's a felony under Illinois law. I sank onto the edge of the bed, pressing the paper to my lap. What do I do? You could take it to the police or file an injunction to stop the sale, but you'll need to move fast. Outside, thunder rolled across the sky. The first drops of rain hit the window, sliding down like veins of glass. I stared at my reflection, pale and still, and saw not the quiet teacher they'd dismissed, but someone else, someone angry, someone awake. They think they can erase me, I whispered. What did you say? Mark asked. Nothing. I lied. Thank you, Mark. I'll figure it out. When I hung up, the house was silent again. Downstairs, laughter drifted faintly from the dining room, Lily's laughter high and triumphant. I folded the photocopy and slipped it into my purse. In the hallway, the family photos lined the walls, smiling faces, from a time when we were still whole. I stopped at one of me at 10 years old, standing beside my father as he held a hammer, showing me how to fix a loose stair. His hand rested proudly on my shoulder. You taught me to build things, Dad, I whispered. So I will. The rain outside grew heavier, tapping against the roof like impatient fingers. I took one last look at the house that had been my world, the place I once believed would always be safe. Then I turned off the light and closed the door behind me, knowing nothing about this family would ever be the same again. Rain blurred the streetlights into long golden streaks as I walked away from the house with my father's old journal pressed against my chest. The sound of the storm swallowed everything behind me, even my mother's voice calling my name, once faint and uncertain. I didn't turn back. My suitcase wheels scraped against the wet pavement, a sound that felt like closure. I didn't know where I was going, only that I couldn't stay another night in a home built on betrayal. I found a studio apartment downtown, a fifth-floor walk-up with peeling paint and a single window that looked over a parking lot. It was small and quiet, which suited me. I spent the first night sitting on the floor with a cup of cheap wine, listening to the rain hammer the glass, thinking about how quickly love could turn into strategy in my family. By morning, the city had shaken off the storm. I started looking for evening classes at the design school on Wabash Avenue. Teaching had always paid the bills, but interior design had been my private language, something my father once encouraged before everything collapsed. It felt like reclaiming a piece of him. 2 weeks passed in a blur of silence and routine. I woke early, went to work, came home, ate dinner alone, and fell asleep with the TV humming in the background. Then one afternoon, my phone buzzed with Mark's name. Emily, his voice was sharp, tired. I've gone through the transaction records. I felt my stomach tighten. And it's not the real estate company. The payment went through something called the Carter Family Trust. I frowned. Carter as in Brandon's family? That's right. It's not public, but it's managed by his mother. It looks like your parents didn't just sell the house, they used it in some kind of private deal. My hand went cold around the phone. So the sale wasn't legal. Not entirely. The trust isn't a registered buyer under Illinois law. It's a personal holding account. If the money originated from Carter Construction, this could be laundering or tax evasion. I sat down, the words echoing in my head. Mark, what does that mean for me? It means they used your name as a shield. If this blows up, the forged signature ties back to you, not them. You're the disposable one in this story. The line went quiet for a moment. I could hear him typing. Emily, you need to file for an injunction immediately. Stop the sale before it closes. After the call ended, I just sat there staring at the journal on my table. The leather cover was cracked, the corners worn. My father's handwriting filled every page with sketches, numbers, bits of thoughts about structures and stability. On the last page, a note I'd never noticed before caught my eye. The ink had faded, but I could still read the words, "If the house is ever in danger, look under the floorboards of the living room. Truth lives where time forgets." My breath caught. It sounded like something out of a movie, but he wasn't a man who wrote in riddles. He was an engineer, precise, deliberate. If he'd hidden something, There had to be a reason. That night, I dreamed of the house. I saw the living room bathed in golden light, heard the floor creak beneath my feet, and felt my father's hand guiding me steady and warm. I woke up before dawn, heart racing. At school the next day, I couldn't focus. My students asked about color theory and texture balance, but my mind was still in that living room. I replayed every sound from that night. The click of my father's lighter, the hush in my mother's voice when money came up the way she'd said, "You'll thank us someday." In the evening, Ethan called. He used to teach part-time with me before moving to Denver for an architectural firm. His tone was calm, like someone who'd learned to build peace out of chaos. "Mark told me what happened," he said. "Are you okay?" "I'm surviving," I replied. "Barely." He was quiet for a moment, then said, "You always see beauty in broken things. Maybe this is your chance to build something new from the wreckage." I almost laughed. "That sounds like something you'd put on a motivational poster." He chuckled softly. "Maybe. But you know I'm right." After we hung up, I sat by the window with the journal in my lap. The city lights shimmered below cars moving like fireflies through the drizzle. I thought about what Mark had said about being the disposable one. Maybe that was true. Maybe in their world, love was an equation, give, take, erase. But in mine, it could still be something solid. The next morning, I took the train to the courthouse on Washington Street and filed the injunction. The clerk looked at me like she'd seen too many daughters suing their parents. I signed the paperwork anyway, my hands steady. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I was standing on my own ground. That night as I was washing dishes, my phone rang again. The screen lit up with Lily's name. I hesitated, then answered. Her voice came through sharp and tight. "You're really doing this suing Mom and Dad on protecting what's mine," I said. "You're jealous. Admit it. You can't stand that I'm finally happy." I laughed quietly. "Jealous of a marriage paid for with stolen money." She exhaled hard. "You don't know anything, Emily. Just stop before you destroy us all." The call ended abruptly, leaving me staring at my reflection in the window. For the first time I realized Lily's anger wasn't just loyalty, it was fear. She knew something. Outside, thunder rumbled again, echoing off the buildings. I closed the curtains, turned off the light, and sat on the couch, the journal open beside me. The inked words seemed to pulse under the lamplight, like they were waiting for me to find the courage to uncover what my father had left behind. Somewhere deep inside, I knew the truth was still buried in that house, and I wasn't done with it yet. 6 months later, the lawsuit had turned into a waiting game. The house sale was officially marked as pending transfer, which meant no one could touch it until the court reached a decision. It was a small victory, but it didn't stop the wedding. My parents and Lily moved forward as if nothing had happened, as if the cracks in our family weren't visible to everyone looking close enough. The invitation came in the mail with gold lettering on cream paper. My name was written in my mother's handwriting, neat and distant. For a while, I considered throwing it away. Then I decided to go. Maybe I needed to see what they'd traded my childhood for. Cannon Beach looked like a postcard that day. The waves rolled quietly beyond the dunes, and a glass pavilion had been built right on the sand for the ceremony. Guests mingled with champagne flutes, the women in soft pastels, the men in tuxedos that smelled faintly of salt and money. I walked in alone, wearing a simple navy dress. A woman with a clipboard looked at me, hesitated, then smiled the way people do when they're unsure if you belong. She led me to a table near the back, close to the catering station. The chairs were folding metal, not the white lacquered ones at the front. From here I could see everything without being part of it. Mom was radiant in silver silk greeting guests with the warmth she'd always withheld from me. Dad stood near the stage, shaking hands with Brandon's father like old business partners. When Mom caught sight of me across the room, her expression didn't even flicker. She simply turned away. The ceremony started. Lily looked breathtaking in her lace gown, walking down the aisle, lined with white roses. For a moment, watching her under the soft light, I almost felt proud. Then the MC's voice echoed through the speakers. "This wedding is a celebration of two families joining together, made possible through the generosity of the Bennett family, who have given so much to make this day perfect." The guests applauded. I felt my stomach twist. They'd sold our home and turned it into a line in a speech, a symbol of prestige. I gripped the edge of the table, my nails digging into the linen. When the vows ended and the reception began, I tried to slip out quietly, but Lily intercepted me near the buffet. She smelled like expensive perfume and roses. Around her neck hung the gold locket my father had promised me on my graduation day, the one he said I'd inherit someday. She touched it with her fingers and smiled. "You always wanted this, didn't you? But you don't deserve it." Her words were sharp, but her eyes flickered as if she wasn't sure she believed them. I swallowed hard, forcing my voice to stay calm. "You think this makes you the winner, Lily? Wearing other people's promises." Her smile faltered for just a second before she turned away to greet a guest. I moved toward the exit, but a familiar voice stopped me. Ethan stood near the corner of the pavilion, camera in hand. He was working for the event company that had designed the setup. The sight of him felt like an anchor in a storm. "You look like you'd rather be anywhere else," he said quietly. I exhaled. "You have no idea." He lowered his voice. "Mark told me. The court issued a temporary hold on the property transfer. It's not over yet. You're winning, Emily." The words hit me harder than I expected. I hadn't realized how much I needed to hear that someone still believed in me. I looked around the glittering hall, the people toasting to a future built on lies, and wondered if any of them could feel how hollow it was. Mom was laughing at a joke Brandon's father made her pearls catching the light. Dad raised his glass. I watched them, wondering if they ever thought about the night I left, or if they'd simply erased me from the picture. After dinner, when the dancing started, I slipped out to the edge of the beach. The wind was sharp, carrying the sound of music from the pavilion. My shoes sank into the sand, and I let the cold air fill my lungs. For a moment, I almost convinced myself that this wasn't my family, that I was just a stranger passing through someone else's celebration. Then I heard footsteps behind me. Lily's voice came low, almost a whisper. "Mom says you're ruining everything. She said you were a mistake, and now you're proving her right." I turned to face her. The moonlight hit her face, pale and trembling. "You know about the forgery, don't you?" She froze. For a second her lips parted, but no sound came out. "I saw your name on the trust documents," I said softly. "You knew they forged my signature and you said nothing." Her hands shook as she brushed her hair from her face. "It wasn't supposed to go this far. Brandon's parents promised it would be temporary, just paperwork to secure the funding. Mom said you'd understand eventually." My voice broke. "Understand? They stole my home, Lily. My life." She took a step back, her eyes glossy. "Please, Emily, don't ruin this. It's all I have." For a moment, I felt the familiar ache of wanting to protect her, but something inside me hardened. "You made your choice." The wind lifted her veil, sending it whipping across the sand. She caught it, her breath coming fast, and when she looked back at me there was a flicker of fear in her eyes, the kind that comes when a person realizes the truth can't be buried forever. I left her standing there under the lights of her perfect wedding, the music fading behind me. My phone buzzed in my pocket. Mark's message appeared on the screen. The handwriting expert confirmed it. "The signature isn't yours." I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of the ocean and the future pressing around me. Somewhere between the roar of the waves and the distant laughter of strangers, I knew this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of something none of them were ready for. 2 weeks after the wedding, I drove back to the house in Evanston under a gray sky that looked ready to break open. The air was sharp with the smell of wet leaves. On the front lawn, a wooden sign read, "Sold pending," in red letters that had started to peel at the corners. The sight of it made my chest tighten. For years, that house had been the one constant in my life, the place I thought would never betray me. Now it stood hollow and still, like a body without a soul. The gate squeaked when I pushed it open. My hand shook a little as I unlocked the door using the spare key I'd never returned. The hinges groaned. Inside, the air was heavy with dust and silence. The furniture was gone, the curtains half drawn, the wallpaper curling at the edges. My footsteps echoed through the living room, each creak reminding me of nights spent on this floor doing homework while my dad read the paper. I set my bag down and opened my father's old journal again, tracing the line that had brought me back. If the house is ever in danger, look under the floorboards of the living room. I wasn't sure what I expected to find. Maybe nothing. Maybe the proof that would finally explain why everything had fallen apart. The floorboards were old oak, dulled by time. I found his hammer in the garage still hanging on a rusty nail where he'd left it years ago. The weight of it felt familiar in my hand. I knelt down and tapped along the boards until I heard a hollow sound near the fireplace. My breath caught. With careful movements, I pried up a section of wood. Dust rose in a soft cloud. Beneath it was a thin layer of insulation, and under that something wrapped in plastic. My fingers trembled as I pulled it free, a waterproof folder sealed tight with yellow tape. I carried it to the window, where light filtered weakly through the blinds. Inside were stacks of papers, contracts, invoices, and what looked like official letters from a city construction department dated 2015. The logo at the top of the page stopped me cold. Carter Construction. As I read, the room began to spin. The documents detailed a public project contract with overpayments routed to a private account. Attached to one invoice was a transfer labeled Wedding Project. The amount, $290,000. My father had kept proof of a fraudulent deal involving Brandon's company, the same money now paying for Lily's wedding. I sank to the floor, the papers spilling across the carpet. It hit me like a wave. My father hadn't been corrupt as Mom used to hint when his business went under. He'd been trying to expose them. The journal, the secrecy, the tension that had filled our home before he died, it all made sense now. He'd been caught between telling the truth and protecting us. My eyes burned. "You were trying to protect me, weren't you, Dad?" I whispered. A sudden sound behind me made me freeze. The front door creaked open. I turned and saw my mother standing in the doorway, her hand gripping the frame. Her eyes widened when she saw the open floor, the scattered documents, and me sitting among them. "What are you doing here?" Her voice was sharp but shaky. I stood slowly, the folder in my hand. "I found what you were hiding." She stepped closer, her face pale. "You shouldn't have come back. You sold this house to cover their crime," I said, holding up the papers. "Dad kept these to expose Carter Construction. You helped them bury it." She flinched as if I'd struck her. "You don't understand. Your father was going to destroy this family. He was obsessed with justice, with proving he was right. I had to make it stop. By selling his evidence, by forging my name." My voice rose. "You call that saving the family?" Tears welled in her eyes. "I did it to protect you and Lily. If this came out back then, none of us would have survived the scandal." I took a step forward, trembling with anger. "You didn't protect us. You just postponed the truth." For a moment, neither of us moved. Dust floated between us like ghosts. I looked at her face, older, fragile, but still proud. Beneath the guilt, there was something else. Fear. I knelt again, gathering the papers, carefully sealing them back in the folder. "These don't belong to you anymore." She reached for my arm. "Please, Emily, don't do this. Think about your sister. She doesn't know how to live without the illusion of perfection." I pulled my arm away. "Then she'll have to learn." Her voice broke. "I'm begging you. If you go public with this, everything will collapse. The Carters will destroy us." I stared at her hand trembling in the air. "You destroyed us long before they did." I took out my phone and snapped photos of the documents, sending them to Mark through a private app he'd set up for sensitive files. "These go to the investigators. If you want to stop me, call the police." She didn't move. Her eyes filled with tears. She tried to blink away. "You're making a mistake." "Maybe," I said quietly. "But at least it'll be my mistake." For a long moment, all I could hear was the wind rattling the windows. My mother finally lowered her hand and stepped back. "You're just like him," she whispered. I wanted to say thank you, but the words stayed caught in my throat. As she left, I stood alone in the empty house, the air thick with memories and dust. The folder felt heavy in my hands, but it wasn't just paper. It was everything my father had died trying to keep safe. Through the window, I watched my mother's car pull away, its tires crunching over the gravel. I knew she wouldn't stay quiet for long. She never did. Still, as I locked the door behind me, I felt something shift inside me. The fear that had followed me for months was fading, replaced by something clearer, harder. I didn't just have the truth now. I had proof. I slipped the folder into my bag and stepped into the cold afternoon light, the sold pending sign clattering in the wind behind me. Somewhere far away, waves crashed against the shore, the same sound I'd heard the night of the wedding. This time it didn't sound like loss. It sounded like the beginning of a reckoning. A month later, the world around me had changed in ways I couldn't have imagined. One morning I woke to the sound of my phone buzzing nonstop. Messages filled the screen, all linking to the same headline splashed across major news outlets. Carter Construction, under federal investigation for fraud and embezzlement. The article detailed the misuse of public funds, suspicious contracts, and a mysterious $290,000 transfer connected to a private trust. I sat at my small kitchen table, coffee untouched, scrolling through the story. My father's old documents had become national evidence. Everything he had tried to protect had finally surfaced. For the first time, it wasn't just my word against theirs. Before I could process it, my phone rang again. Lily's name flashed on the screen. Her voice came through shaky and desperate. "Emily, what did you do?" "You ruined everything. The company's losing contracts, Brandon's lawyers are calling nonstop, and Mom can't even go to the grocery store without reporters following her." "You destroyed us." I took a slow breath. "No, Lily, I didn't destroy anything. I just stopped pretending." She went silent for a beat, then hissed, "You think you're some kind of hero? You're just bitter." Her words stung less than I expected. "You're angry because the lie finally broke. You're living off stolen money and you know it." She hung up before I could finish. I stared at the window. Outside, snow had started to fall, covering the street in thin white dust. It was quiet, peaceful, almost cruelly calm, considering the chaos spreading through every headline. Later that week, Ethan showed up at my apartment, shoulders dusted with snow. He looked tired but steady, like someone who'd already made his peace with bad news. He smiled faintly when I opened the door. "You made the front page," he said, setting a coffee cup on the counter. "I didn't want this kind of fame." "Maybe not, but it's the kind that changes things." He hesitated before speaking again. "They let me go." I blinked. "What, Carter Construction owns part of the firm I work for? They told me to rewrite the inspection reports on a few old projects to make them look clean." I refused. He shrugged. "So they cut me loose." I felt anger rise again, sharp and familiar. "They punished you for telling the truth." He met my eyes. "Yeah, but maybe it's time I build something that belongs to me." We sat in silence for a while, the city humming outside. Then he leaned forward slightly. "You've spent months fighting to save a house they already stole from you. What if you built something new instead? Something honest?" I frowned. "Like what? An art installation? A way to tell the real story? Your father's story?" The idea took root before I could stop it. I pictured wood from the old house, metal pieces from his tools, the pages from his journal displayed under glass. It wouldn't be revenge. It would be truth made visible. We called it the Truth House. For weeks, we worked in his rented warehouse studio near the Chicago River. I collected pieces of wood and tiles from the demolition site, each one covered in dust and memory. I spent hours sanding, painting, arranging, until the fragments began to form something whole. Ethan handled the structure, sketching frameworks and cutting steel beams. Sometimes we worked in silence, sometimes to the low hum of an old radio. One night, as I adjusted a beam under the dim light, my phone rang again. It was an unknown number. "Ms. Bennett, this is Detective Carlson with the Chicago Police Department. We need you to come in for questioning regarding leaked evidence in the Carter investigation." My pulse jumped. Leaked evidence. What are you talking about? There's a complaint filed by your mother. She alleges that you unlawfully obtained and distributed confidential material. I could barely speak. I'm one of the rightful owners of the property where those documents were found. I understand, but we still need you to make a statement. Tomorrow morning, 10 o'clock. When the call ended, Ethan looked at me. They're trying to scare you. I know, I said, forcing a laugh that sounded hollow. It's working. The next morning, the interrogation was short. The detective's tone was polite but detached. Once they confirmed I still held partial ownership of the property, they had no grounds for charges. The case was dismissed before lunch. Still, I walked out of the station with shaking hands. Even when you're innocent, being treated like a criminal leaves a mark. That evening, as I returned to the studio, I found Lily waiting outside. Her eyes were red, her hair a mess, a far cry from the polished bride at Cannon Beach. She held a small silver flash drive in her hand. "I need to talk to you," she said quietly. I opened the door and we stepped inside. The half-finished installation loomed in the dim light, wood panels rising like ribs of a skeleton. She looked around, whispering, "You built this from what they destroyed." I nodded. "Why are you here, Lily?" She handed me the flash drive. "You're not the only one who kept things. Brandon kept records, transfers, receipts, payments. He made me delete them from his computer, but I made a backup." I stared at her. "Why are you giving me this now?" Her voice cracked. "Because everything's collapsing. The money's gone. The company's going under. Mom's falling apart. I thought if I gave this to you, maybe you'd stop. Maybe we could save what's left." I felt the metal drive warm in my palm. "You still think this is about saving them?" She looked at me, eyes glossy. "Isn't it? No, Lily. It's about saving yourself." Her lips trembled. "I don't know how." "Start by telling the truth." Tears spilled down her cheeks. She turned and walked toward the door, pausing only once. "I never hated you, Emily. I just didn't want to be you." The door closed behind her with a soft click. I stood in the quiet, holding the flash drive like a fragile pulse. On the desk beside me, my father's journal lay open to the last page, the ink smudged but legible. "Truth is the only thing worth building," he had written. I plugged the drive into Ethan's laptop, watching as folders of files appeared on the screen, each one a nail in the coffin of the Carter Empire. Outside, the snow had stopped. The city lights reflected off the river, cold and bright like a promise. I didn't know what would come next, but I knew this much: the truth had finally found its voice, and it was louder than fear. 3 months later, the courthouse in downtown Chicago was filled with reporters, cameras, and strangers hungry for someone else's downfall. My name was printed in bold letters across the docket: Margaret Bennett et al. Versus Emily Bennett. Plaintiff my mother, with Carter Construction's lawyers seated beside her. Defendant me, represented by Mark. The irony wasn't lost on me. I had spent years trying to earn my family's approval, and now I was the one they wanted punished. The air in the courtroom was heavy with perfume cologne and quiet judgment. My mother sat upright at the plaintiff's table, her hair perfectly styled pearls at her throat. She didn't look at me. Her attorney stood and began outlining their case, painting me as a resentful daughter who had stolen confidential corporate material and leaked it to the press for revenge. Every word felt like a blade twisting deeper. When it was our turn, Mark rose, calm and methodical. He handed a folder to the judge. "Your Honor, we have verified forensic evidence that my client's signature on the property sale was forged. We also have confirmation from the FBI that the financial transaction in question involved embezzled government funds totaling $290,000 redirected through Carter Construction's private trust." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. My mother's lawyer tried to object, but the judge raised a hand. "Continue, Mr. Hayes." Mark placed the flash drive on the evidence table. "Contained here are transaction records recovered from the plaintiff's son-in-law's personal accounts, provided voluntarily by a cooperating witness." I could feel Lily's gaze from the second row. She looked pale, clutching her purse like a shield. The judge reviewed the document silently, his face unreadable. Finally, he looked up. This evidence has been verified by federal investigators. Mark nodded. Yes, Your Honor. The FBI has confirmed the authenticity. My mother shot to her feet. Her voice cracked through the silence. We did everything for this family's name. She wants to destroy us. Her outburst startled even her own lawyer. The judge gave her a measured look. Mrs. Bennett, please sit down. She did, trembling her composure, slipping for the first time in years. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. There was something almost fragile in the way she gripped the table-edge knuckles white. When Mark called me to the stand, my pulse hammered in my throat. I swore in my voice, barely above a whisper, then faced the courtroom. He asked how I had discovered the documents. I told the truth, from finding the journal to unearthing the folder under the living room floor. Every word tasted like iron. When I finished, the judge turned to the plaintiff's side. Mrs. Bennett, would you like to cross-examine your daughter? For a moment, she didn't move. Then she stood, eyes burning. Why couldn't you just let it go, Emily? Your father's mistakes were buried for a reason. You've dragged us through the mud. Is that what you call justice? I met her gaze. Dad didn't make mistakes, Mom. He was trying to do the right thing. You just didn't want to face what that meant. Her lips trembled. We sacrificed everything for you and your sister. I shook my head. You sacrificed truth for pride. The judge cleared his throat, and she stepped back, sitting down hard. I glanced toward Lily again. She was staring at the floor, motionless. The next witness called was her. She hesitated before walking to the stand, her heels echoing against the marble floor. When she took the oath, her hands shook. The opposing lawyer asked Ms. Carter, when did you first become aware of the existence of these financial documents? She looked at me, then at Mom, then back at the lawyer. Before the wedding, she whispered. The lawyer blinked. Before the wedding. Are you saying you knew about the transfers? Lily nodded, tears sliding down her cheeks. Yes, Brandon told me it was just business, that the money was temporary. But I saw the invoices. I knew it wasn't right. A wave of noise swept through the gallery. My mother's face went blank, as if someone had pulled the ground out from under her. The judge raised his hand again for silence. Go on, Ms. Carter. She swallowed hard. I stayed quiet because I was scared. Because I thought if I didn't, we'd lose everything. But now I've already lost it. She covered her face, shoulders shaking. For a moment, no one spoke. Even the court reporter stopped typing. The silence was the kind that pressed against your chest until breathing felt like guilt. Finally, the judge leaned forward. I have heard enough for today. His tone softened slightly. The evidence presented here will be submitted to federal authorities for a full criminal investigation. Until further notice, the sale of the Bennett property will remain suspended. This court also recommends that Mr. Brandon Carter be taken into custody pending further inquiry. A murmur swept through the courtroom again. The bailiff moved toward the back, where Brandon sat rigid beside his attorney. He didn't resist as they led him out, face pale, jaw tight. My mother didn't look up. Her shoulders sagged, her hand gripping the pearl necklace at her throat until it snapped, beads scattering across the floor like small white lies. The sound of them hitting the tile echoed through the room. I stayed seated as people began to whisper, pack their bags, and drift toward the doors. Mark touched my shoulder lightly. You did it. I shook my head. No. The truth did. When I finally stood, my legs felt unsteady. I glanced one last time at my mother, who sat staring at nothing, her lips moving silently, maybe praying, maybe cursing me. I didn't know which. Outside, the sun was setting behind the courthouse, casting the street in gold. I took a deep breath, the cold air filling my lungs. It wasn't victory I felt, just release. Justice had come, but it had taken everything with it, and somewhere deep inside I knew this wasn't over. Not yet. A month after the trial, I got the call I had been dreading. My mother was in the hospital. Heart failure, the doctor said, his voice carefully, even as if emotion might break the professional barrier. For a long moment, I couldn't speak. I just listened to the quiet hum of the phone line until he repeated my name. When I finally walked into the cardiac wing at Northwestern Memorial, the antiseptic air hit me like a wall. Machines beeped softly in rhythm with her shallow breathing. Her once perfect hair was now streaked with gray, her face pale against the white sheets. For a moment, I barely recognized her. A nurse stopped me at the door and handed me a sealed envelope. "She asked her lawyer to deliver this to you if you came," the nurse said. Said it was important. I took it with trembling hands and sat in the chair beside her bed. The envelope was thick, the paper worn. Inside was a single handwritten letter in my father's careful script, dated 2020. My heart clenched as I began to read. My dearest Emily, if you are reading this, it means the truth has finally caught up to us. Years ago, I accepted a payment from Carter Construction, a so-called consulting fee, that turned out to be part of a political trap. When I discovered the truth, I refused to use the money. I kept every document to expose them when the time was right. Your mother feared it would destroy us. She thought silence could save the family. Forgive her fear, for it came from love. I stopped tears blurring the ink. The words continued faintly toward the bottom of the page. I built our house with my own hands so that truth would always have walls strong enough to hold it. If it falls, rebuild it. Do not let shame write our story. The paper slipped from my fingers. I pressed my palm over my mouth to stifle the sob rising in my throat. He hadn't been corrupt. He had been cornered, tricked, and silenced. Everything Mom had done selling the house, forging my name, was a desperate attempt to protect a lie she thought was noble. The door creaked open. Lily stood there, her eyes red, her coat still damp from the rain outside. She hesitated, then crossed the room, sitting down in the chair beside me. For a long while, neither of us spoke. Finally, she whispered, "I knew about the money, Emily. I found out before the wedding." I turned to her slowly. "You knew?" She nodded, wiping her face. "Brandon told me it was just a temporary transfer, that Dad had been part of something, but it was all cleaned up. I wanted to believe him. I didn't want to think Mom could be part of it. When everything came out, I panicked. I used part of the wedding fund to cover it, thinking I could fix things before anyone noticed." Her voice broke. "I was stupid. I kept telling myself I was protecting us, but you were the only one who actually did." I reached for her hand. "You made a mistake, Lily, but so did all of us." She shook her head. "No. You fought for the truth. I hid from it." The monitor beside Mom's bed beeped softly, each tone, a reminder that time was running thin. I stood and brushed a strand of hair from her forehead. Her eyelids fluttered, and for a moment I thought she was gone. Then she whispered my name, barely audible. "I'm here, Mom," I said, leaning closer. Her eyes opened, cloudy, but aware. "Did you read his letter?" "Yes," I whispered. "I know everything now." She nodded, faintly, tears pooling at the corners of her eyes. "I wanted to tell you, but I was afraid. Your father believed truth could save us. I believed silence would. We were both wrong." Her hand trembled in mine. "Forgive me if you can. But don't waste your life proving me wrong. Build something better from what we broke." I squeezed her hand gently. "I will." Her breathing grew shallow again. I felt the pressure of her fingers fade. A nurse came in quietly, checking the monitors, adjusting something. I stepped back, my chest hollow. Lily clung to my arms, sobbing quietly. "She's still my mom," she whispered. I nodded. "She's ours, no matter what she did." We stayed there for hours, until the soft hum of the machines faded into a long, steady tone. The nurse returned and placed a hand on my shoulder, her eyes kind. I didn't cry right away. I just stood there watching the rain start again outside the window, washing the city in gray. When we finally walked out of the hospital, Lily held the letter against her chest. "What are you going to do now?" she asked. I looked up at the skyline, the city lights blurred by rain. "I don't know yet," I said. "But Dad told me to rebuild. And maybe that's the only thing left to do." The wind picked up, carrying the scent of wet pavement and something softer, almost clean. For the first time in years, I felt like the weight pressing on my chest had loosened. Justice had torn us apart, but maybe healing would be the thing that put us back together. I didn't know what form it would take or where to start. I only knew that the truth, once buried beneath the floor of that house, was finally free. And now it was my turn to decide what to build from its ashes. 2 years passed before I realized how much peace could grow out of ruin. The world had changed, but mostly I had. The old house was gone for good, reduced to fragments and splinters, but Ethan and I had kept enough of its bones to build something new. We found land near a quiet stretch of forest outside Bend, Oregon, where the air smelled of pine and rain, and the sound of the wind could almost erase the noise of the past. We called it the Bennett House. Not a mansion or even a proper home, but a studio built from reclaimed wood and salvaged bricks, every board touched by memory. It wasn't meant to be mine alone. It belonged to every woman who had lost her place, every child who needed a space to draw their own beginning. With a grant from a local arts foundation, we turned it into a small school teaching painting, pottery, and woodworking to people who had nothing left but their hands and hope. Ethan worked beside me, patient and steady as always. He handled the structure, I handled the light. We argued sometimes about colors, about where the windows should face, but those were good fights, the kind that ended in laughter and sawdust. Some nights when the stars came out over the trees, I could still hear my father's voice in the wind, reminding me how to measure twice before cutting, how to trust what was solid, even when everything else cracked. Lily visited often. The first time she came, she stood outside for a long time before walking in, her eyes tracing the walls like she recognized the ghosts living in the grain of the wood. She didn't apologize, and I didn't ask her to. Instead, she picked up a paintbrush and began helping the kids cover one wall in wild colors. We didn't need to talk about forgiveness anymore. It had already happened in the quiet space between us. One evening, I received a letter from our lawyer. I sat on the porch with a mug of tea as the last light of day brushed the trees in gold. The envelope felt heavier than it should. Inside was the final verdict from the court. The case was closed. Brandon Carter had been sentenced to 5 years in federal prison for fraud and embezzlement. My father, Henry Bennett, was officially cleared of all allegations. His name, after all those years, was clean. I stared at the paper for a long time, unable to move. Ethan came out wiping his hands on a rag and leaned against the railing beside me. He saw the letter and nodded slowly. I handed it to him without speaking. After a moment, he folded it back up and set it on the table. He said softly, "It's done now." I shook my head. Not done. Just right. We sat there as the sun dipped behind the pines, the air turning cooler, the shadows stretching across the clearing. I looked at the boards beneath my feet, the same ones my father had once cut for our living room floor. They creaked gently when the wind blew. I whispered almost to myself, "They sold our home to buy their reputation, and I rebuilt it to find the truth." Ethan smiled faintly. "That sounds like something your dad would have said." I nodded. Maybe it was. A few weeks later, we held an open day at the studio. Children ran barefoot across the grass, their laughter echoing through the trees. Women from nearby shelters brought paintings and sculptures they'd made during our classes. Reporters came too, asking about the story behind the Bennett house, but I told them it wasn't about the past anymore. It was about what came after. When everyone had left, I walked through the empty studio, touching the walls, feeling the warmth still lingering in the air. Every mark, every scar in the wood told a story of survival. The floorboards gleamed faintly in the fading light, and I imagined my father standing there nodding in quiet approval. Outside, Lily was cleaning brushes at the water pump. She looked up and smiled. "You did it," she said. "We did?" I corrected. She laughed softly. "I never thought we'd get here." Neither did I. That night, after everyone was gone, I stayed on the porch alone. The forest hummed with the sound of crickets. The house glowed faintly behind me, yellow light spilling through the windows. I thought about my mother, about how fear had guided every decision she'd made. I hoped wherever she was, she could see what her silence had built in the end. For the first time in years, I felt light. Not because everything was perfect, but because I no longer needed it to be. The truth was enough. The wind rustled through the trees, carrying the scent of cedar and rain. I closed my eyes and let it fill me. They once called me a mistake. But that mistake had rebuilt everything worth keeping. If you've ever been told you're not enough, remember this. No one can sell the truth of who you are. No one can take what you're willing to rebuild. Sometimes the pieces that break are the ones that make the strongest foundation. The last light faded, and the forest settled into quiet. Behind me, the Bennett house stood firm against the dark, its windows shining like small, steady stars.